Welcome to our Women in Power podcast. This series, produced by UN Women, features conversations about the representation of women in power and decision-making in Asia and the Pacific. My name is Marian Lockington and I work for UN Women in Fiji. I'm pleased to introduce this episode featuring Jennifer Kalpokas Doan, the Executive Director of the Pacific Regional Program at Balance of Power, Vanuatu. She spoke with Julie Marks from UN Women.
Jennifer, thanks very much. Your work with Balance of Power covers 3 Pacific Island nations, your home, Vanuatu plus Tonga and Fiji. From your vantage point in the Pacific, why is it important to have women in leadership positions?
I think, first of all, at the national level, I think it would be to the detriment of people, societies and governments to not have women in leadership positions. I mean, women make up half of the population, in fact, probably more than half in some of our Pacific Island countries. And to not have their voices heard by the women themselves, it deprives a country or a society of half of what needs to be said and what decisions need to be taken to represent the entire population. And in our Pacific countries, as is the case with a lot of the majority world, is what I'll call them, which is often referred to as the development world, there's still a large adherence to cultural norms and societal norms around women's legitimacy to be leaders. And I think by that argument, often you hear that, well, men can take your voices for you. They can represent on your behalf, but men only represent half of, the human demographic in any society. And so therefore, without women, I think we're depriving society of optimizing on how much more it could achieve for itself if those voices aren't heard and spoken for themselves. I think if you say that men can take our voices for us, it implies that women aren't capable, and women are, and we've seen that the world over.
So what are some of the barriers that are preventing more women from participating in decision making and from there being equal representation in leadership positions in Vanuatu? And in fact, you've mentioned several already, such as cultural norms.
We've often grappled with this question ourselves in the work that we do, and strictly thinking about political leadership, if we're talking about political leadership for a minute here, it is such an unattractive career path for a woman. And I say that because we've often talked about how the rules of the game have been set by men. Often in ways that are discriminatory to women even entering that playing field. And even when they do venture into it, the pressure to perform at the same level as the way men perform, adversely disadvantages women's ability to do it. Because we don't start from the same kind of level playing field, and because the way the art of negotiations and the way that politics is played is very prescribed by how men view their role in society, which is an area that women find it difficult already to kind of break into. And so, it's almost tiring to just even think about wanting to do it. And so often very, very capable women, very, very highly qualified women will not even enter the game because it's just too hard. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the main barriers. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we do live in societies that are still very, very, very much linked to a patriarchal society, a patriarchal way of living, social norms around custom and culture, a woman's place in society, religion, all of those things, conveniently are reinforced by those who maintain control and power. And so the way society is framed and how we accept the rules that we play by are highly dependent on the people who have the influence to determine what those things look like, and most of those are men. And so those continue to be barriers for women getting into positions of leadership, because it filters down through everything, through all aspects of society, you know, in the workforce, in the formal workforce, in public service, in the private sector. That is changing, you know, enormously. We've seen changes in our countries, in the countries that I work in anyway, in the Pacific. You know, and I think that's due to greater exposure and greater understanding, and we've got a generational shift in the way that we perceive human rights and the rights of women. But, you know, I think we do still have a fair way to go before we can actually say that, you know, women have an equal footing and equal access to opportunities.
Can you explain what your organisation Balance of Power does?
Balance of power has come about after there was a recognition that, you know, a lot of effort over the years, you know, probably over the past 20 years or so, more actually, has been focused around, you know, when we talk about gender equality, it's been focused around addressing the capabilities of women. There's been large investments into, you know, capacity building of women to be able to do, you know, certain things, in women's economic empowerment and women's leadership. And the focus has been on the individuals, has been on the women themselves, almost kind of not recognizing that women live in an ecosystem, and it's not a lack of capacity or a lack of capability that is you know, the barrier to women getting ahead. It's the way society is constructed around them. And so Balance of Power was designed as a program that would look at what these social norms are, what are these other underlying, under the iceberg, if you want to call it that, barriers to women's ability to progress, but also in changing perceptions about women's legitimacy. Not women themselves, but their legitimacy and their ability to lead, to be recognized as legitimate leaders. Because women are exercising leadership in all aspects of society, but whether or not they are recognized as legitimate leaders who can make decisions, who can, you know, lead and, you know, be part of the decision making, not just in the informal, but in the formal. That's kind of that sweet spot that we need to get over. And that legitimacy, or lack of legitimacy that's given to women, is not just being done by men. It is a societal thing. And so because it's linked to our culture and our social norms, even women aren't giving other women that legitimacy. And so Balance of Power's work is around addressing what are those social norms, and then how do we work in a way that is non-confrontational, that is working with the grain, that is saying, you know, perhaps it is about the messaging and who it is that we're using, and rather than, you know, having outwardly vocal advocates that are talking about the rights of women, you actually work with the grain. Where are the influences in churches and religious groups, and, you know, in custom, you know, structures and things like that that can carry that message on our behalf. I think for Tonga in particular, Tonga's an extremely interesting case. Tonga is a monarch, one of the only monarchs, or the only active monarchs in the Pacific. Tonga prides itself of having never been colonized. However, Tonga has a very strong adherence to religion, to Christianity, and the social hierarchy with the monarch itself and then with Christianity presents almost a dual kind of dual layers that a social norm program would have to address. And Tonga has one of the highest percentages per capita of people that have PhDs. A big, you know, an enormous number, like a large proportion of the population that are Tongans, do not live in Tonga. And so, you know, and that is probably a reflection of the way the society is, because it's an extremely stringent hierarchical society. You it is already difficult to have the kind of opportunities that, let's say, for instance, nobles might have access to. And that includes access to land as well. Women in Tonga do not have access to land. They're not allowed to have access to land, and that's another one of the cultural barriers. And so there are a lot of push factors, you might say, in Tonga that makes it more attractive for Tongans to move away and to live abroad in America and New Zealand and Australia. And I think whilst there is a large recognition of women's capabilities and their ability to hold, senior level positions in government, in the private sector, there still remains a gap between moving from the senior level of government into political life. And for us in Balance of Power, what we're trying to understand is what is the barrier in that little bit, and how do you overcome it? How do you create the enabling environment? That may be through legislature, it may be through, other different kinds of advocacy. But a big part of it is to do with perceptions, is to do with how people perceive, again, women's legitimacy. And then that combined with how difficult it is to even put up your hand to run for elections is the other bit. We kind of have to have a multi-pronged approach in addressing different parts of it so that they're all working together to eventually then you start to see more people, more women putting up their hand and then more women running, but also more voters seeing that women are legitimate leaders and voting for women, both men and women. Yeah.
Jennifer, when it comes to the legitimacy of women leaders, do you notice there's a difference in perception between the generations?
Yes.
I mean, out of interest, what seems to be the view of Gen Z, for example, or Gen Alpha and teenagers?
I have young children as well, and my eldest son is 20, and so I have a direct window into what their conversations are like and how they're viewing things. And one of the interesting things I think he asked me was, there was this program that was being done by Peace Corps in Vanuatu, and it was called Smart Sisters, and it was about encouraging young girls who were in high school to go into they were encouraging women to take up the STEM kind of stream of studies, and the program was called Smart Sisters, and it was geared towards like Form 5, Form 6, Form 7 level. And my son asked me, why do we have Smart Sisters, Mum? Why don't we have Smart Brothers? Uh-huh. And I had to it made me realize, in your lived experience, you don't realize that we live in a patriarchal society and you can't feel it because you're a boy. They're living in a generation now, in an age now, where there's such an enormous flow of information, there's so much equality between them that they don't have this sense of, I don't understand why there needs to be special attention to women. What's the issue? And so you have to kind of take them back to understand that society is structured around a patriarchal system that elevates men to a status that's far above women. And so we don't start on a level playing field. And so there are many efforts. And he's like, why do we have like programs around women in leadership? And why don't we have programs around men in leadership? And these are very real questions, but they're very telling of a generation that doesn't have it as a lived experience, that doesn't see it as something that's an issue for them, really. And I guess the sad thing is that society then starts to, once they've gone into uni and then they enter the workforce and they become exposed to, other rules of how, public service operates, and where, those patriarchal structures are still very much alive. And so it's very easy for them to get into it. When they're at a younger age, in their teen years, in their formative years, they don't have an awareness of it as much. And it's almost like if you just hold on to that and then put them into the workforce, they're going to be, the change agents that you want to see. They're going to, look at their lives differently.
Looking now at your parents' generation, how do the views differ in terms of the perception of women's leadership?
I was born when in the same year that Vanuatu gained its independence.
Oh.
And so in the first decade of my life, my parents and their generation was very, very focused on nation building. And so a big part of what they were doing it wasn't necessarily a consideration of gender and women and who's doing what where. In fact, in probably the first or the second parliament, there were women in parliament straight away. I don't think that the issue of gender was a very big thing at the time, because the focus of the country was building itself as a sovereign state, and I guess proving to England and France that they could do it. And so it meant that the government at the time was very focused on building a workforce that was going to build the country. So there was a large emphasis on, we need to train doctors and lawyers and teachers and nurses. And so, unfortunately, it naturally went, to the caring kind of, teachers and nurses women were encouraged to do that, and men were then sent to go and study to be doctors and, engineers. I believe that my parents encouraged, both girls and boys. My parents' generation were very adamant to kind of train a workforce that was going to build a country. And so they had gone through it, and their interest was on, how do we train people, the workforce that's going to build our country. We're a very small island state, so we don't have very much by way of natural resources, and so our biggest resource is our people. As urbanization has increased and we've had to have more migration into the urban areas, the inward migration has brought with it, all of the kind of, I'd say the stronger adherence to culture and cultural norms that have come in from like the more rural areas. We're islands, so the capital is on an island, so people from another island will be coming in with their own very strong cultural norms, where in the urban area, in the capital, that might not be the case as much anymore. And so if you've got an influx of another belief system that's going to overtake the one that's there, obviously it'll start to kind of encroach in what's already, what might seem like already a liberated way of thinking. But that said, the population is one that is a lot more educated, a lot more aware. And so, I think often we'll see, the fallback to kind of, but our culture says that it's a certain way, but they sound more like excuses rather than, something that people actually believe in.
Jennifer, what do you hope balance of power can achieve in the medium term?
Again, we have these high-level aspirational goals about, over time women will be increasingly culturally, socially, and economically recognized as legitimate leaders, and that we will, because of that, we'll be able to see more women in parliament. That's an aspirational goal to keep as a beacon, as something to work towards, but recognizing that in order to get there, we need to be able to see the incremental shifts and the changes along the way. We also know that, it's not a 10-year, we're not going to achieve this goal in 10, probably not even 20 years, but we're going to try our hardest to make sure that we're addressing those barriers in our societies and the ways that we think and perceive and legitimize women, so that we can eventually get there. We've been working in the 3 countries in the Pacific over the last 5 years. A big part of that was being innovative. If you're doing a program around social norm change, it's a free-for-all in whatever it might be, or whatever intervention it might look like, to try to influence and change perceptions and to shift people into a different mindset, into a different way of thinking. And that's very difficult to capture in reporting, or to tell a story of success. And so I think in each of the countries, the contexts are quite different. Fiji is very different from Vanuatu, is very different from Tonga. We have different cultures, we've got different political systems, we've got different actors, and so no one country looks the same in its programming. And that's because the program tries to be sensitive and to be flexible and adaptable to whatever it is that country needs at that time. And that might be through the use of, media, it might be through campaigns, it might be through working with churches, working with kava clubs in Tonga, for instance, where you're sitting with men in a men-only social gathering and having conversations around just what do you think your wife should be able to do in your home. Incremental, slowly, with the grain, non-confrontational, ways to have conversations that allow people to come to that acceptance on their own. But at the same time, also working with national structures such as, ministries of justice that house the departments of women's affairs, and looking at national gender equality policies and how do you try to leverage off of what are those activities, how can you support that. Supporting legislative reform agendas of government, working with, electoral commissions and things like that, working with parliaments, working with elected MPs. So again, that multi-pronged approach to try and address the issue from multiple different angles and with multiple different partners, and always trying to be innovative. And so I think we can see there are shifts there. They might be slow and they might look ad hoc. When you look across a 5-year program, you might wonder, why have you done this? But I think if all of these incremental shifts are combined together, they actually tell a story of change. And I think the key is to be patient, because the change will come, but the change will be long and progressive over time. But we keep our finger on the pulse all the time. We're continuously looking at ways to try to be a lot more creative, and then the term strike while the iron is hot, when there is political will and there are people who are influential and who are willing to make the change. We saw in Vanuatu in May this year, we had a referendum that stipulates a quota requirement for a woman to be a part of a political party's executive, which increases her chances exponentially to be fielded as a candidate. And so we can see that all of these things working in different parts of society together actually start to mobilize people to start to think a certain way. And after a while, you kind of step back and you watch society change on its own. And that, there's probably never a clear, I can point to this exactly, that balance of power did this and this here. But you flood the market, as it were, as much as possible with, different approaches, different stakeholders, different partners, different influences, men predominantly. For long enough, you start to see how people begin to mobilize and change the way. And we've seen evidence of this in all 3 countries. We've seen evidence of the change in the way people interact on social media towards women, and the way that they talk about women in leadership. Last month, in Port Vila, which is the capital of Vanuatu, it was for the first time we elected a lady mayor and a deputy who was a woman. And so the biggest urban centre in the country, which holds the seat of government, is being led by 2 women, which, would not have happened. I'm not going to say that Balance of Power can claim any of that on its own, but a combined effort with different partners working together for the same purpose has eventually changed the way society is, more accepting and legitimizing women. And, I guess the work now is to continue to support their exercise of leadership, so that they can continue to demonstrate what it looks like when a woman is in a leadership position, enough so that she can be the evidence, they can be the evidence of what it looks like when a woman is in a position of leadership, thereby influencing more people to put their hand up to do it, and changing the way society perceives them, so that more people can start to vote for women.
Okay, last question, and in fact it's related to your point on influencing people. Jennifer, what's your advice for young women today in the Pacific who are at the start of their careers in terms of their level of aspiration?
Be bold, be brave, don't be afraid to push boundaries, don't be afraid to ask questions. You are growing up in a society that is a lot more aware, that has a lot more safeguards and protections around your ability to stand up and speak. You have a higher platform you're starting off on than perhaps we did, or my mother did, or her mother. So use it. The more voices there are that speak for different generations, the more different lived experiences that we can share as a society, the greater that movement or that mobilization of voices can be together to start to influence society. Don't lose sight of the things that you hold true, your identity, your faith, your adherence to your customs and your beliefs, absolutely. But where they might appear to be harmful to you, perhaps rethink how you can move from that and find different ways to interact. But be bold, because there has never been such a time as this, and you will never be this young again.
Jennifer, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of our Women in Power podcast.